The United States of America is a nation founded by genocide, built by slavery, and expanded by war. America is not a nation of immigrants. America is not a melting pot. The story of this country is steeped in the blood of oppressed peoples, still. This country is no stranger to oppression, though there is much, much more to this statement than I will cover here. For the sake of time, I will limit myself to two main groups to illustrate this point. Without genocide, America would not exist, at least in this form, but probably at all. The initial conquering of this continent by Europeans was a Holocaust, an outright genocide of over 90% of the indigenous population. In the foundation of our nation's identity, Native Americans were the enemy, reduced in our popular consciousness to savage animals, which couldn't be further from the truth. In the expansion of our nation, Native Americans were murdered and stolen from over and over and over again. Many treaties were signed in an effort to legitimize the destruction of so many cultures and peoples, but they were signed at gunpoint. The Trail of Tears in the early mid-19th century was a step forward for Americans' goal of manifest destiny. However, it claimed the lives of over 13,000 Native Americans. The war, or many wars, fought against the indigenous peoples of this country by our government went on in earnest for over 100 years, taking much more than just lives from the only people with any arguable natural right to be here. As more and more reservations were established, the average American could convince themselves that this war was over, that Native Americans were no longer the enemy. There is a popular misconception that Native Americans were given their land by the government. People who know nothing about the suffering of these people have a lot to say when it comes to how they envision easy, tax-free life on reservations to be. What most don't care to learn is that Native Americans have the highest poverty rate in the country of any racial group, 39% on reservations and 26% off reservations. 80% of reservation students read below their reading level. Even today, 4 out of 5 Native American women are raped, stalked, or abused in their lifetime. 9 out of 10 of the perpetrators are non-Native. The biggest Native news story in several years, the Standing Rock protests, where countless Native Americans were brutalized by police, was followed up by the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline anyway. A year later, the pipeline has already had an 84-gallon spill on reservation land. Though they make up only 0.8% of the population, indigenous people make up 2% of all police killings. Native Americans, whose history is filled with abuse and deliberate genocide at the hands of the U.S. government, our government, are still suffering. The official United Nations estimate for the death toll of the African slave trade is 17 million. The United States of America was built by this labor. The economy of our young nation was dependent on slavery. The White House was built by slaves. 12 of our first 18 presidents owned slaves, 8 of whom owned slaves while serving as president. While the 13th Amendment finally abolished slavery in 1865, it did so except as punishment for a crime. This loophole was immediately exploited, and thus began the mass incarceration of black people in this country. It wasn't until 1870 that black men were finally guaranteed the right to vote with the 15th Amendment. 7 years later, Reconstruction ended in the South, and what's been called the Civil Rights Nadir began. This was a period where state governments, especially in the South, essentially stripped black Americans of any gains they made after the Civil War. They couldn't vote, they were painted as criminals, rapists, and animals. The past was rewritten in history textbooks and in popular novels and films like Gone with the Wind and The Birth of a Nation, so that support for a post-slavery culture dwindled. The myth was propagated that black people preferred to be slaves. In 1915, after purging all of the black employees he could from every level of the federal government, our progressive president, Woodrow Wilson, had a private viewing of The Birth of a Nation at the White House, a movie that glorifies the Ku Klux Klan and paints all black people as inferior criminals. Largely because of this film, the KKK made a comeback. Between 1882 and 1968, about 3,500 black people were lynched in this country. Over 1,000 whites were also lynched, by and large for helping black folks or taking anti-lynching stances. The greatest leaders of the civil rights movement were assassinated. The Nixon administration targeted black Americans with his tough-on-crime rhetoric. Reagan followed this up with the war on drugs. Both of these blatantly and on record targeted black people. Incarceration rates skyrocketed under Reagan, and with the Clinton administration came mandatory minimums and the destructive 3 strikes rule that puts 3-time felons in prison for life, regardless of whether their felonies were violent. Cheap or entirely forced prison labor is a billion-dollar industry, built out of the mass incarceration of the poor, especially black and Latinx Americans. Black men make up 6.5% of the American population, but make up 40% of American prisoners. African Americans are incarcerated at more than 5 times the rate of whites. Latinx Americans are incarcerated over twice the rate of whites. Prison gerrymandering, which gives extra political power to politicians who, with prisons in their districts, targets black and Latinx Americans specifically. Private prisons, which are a huge contributor to the national economy, have quotas to meet. Financial leaders and representatives from the prison industry help to draft and vote on laws, like they did in the organization ALEC until recently. The prison industrial complex, which includes countless state and for-profit prisons, as well as tons of vendor corporations, is directly dependent on very large incarcerated populations doing cheap or forced labor, disproportionately people of color. With our nation's history, it is no surprise at all that people of color being murdered by police feels every day to us now. It's been going on for decades. Like always, African Americans who stand up against this obvious injustice are painted as unpatriotic, as ungrateful, and as criminals. This country has existed so long to serve the needs of the people at the top. A 2015 study done by Princeton University determined that public opinion has virtually no impact on U.S. law. It determined that the number of American voters for or against any idea has no impact at all on the likelihood that it will be made law. However, the economic elite in this country can buy influence. Despite the average American having virtually no impact on the process, the passing of any given law is correlated positively with its support by the top 10% of wage earners in the United States. As it has always been, the people in power serve their own interests. The only difference is that the gap in wealth, and therefore power, between the elites and everyone else has grown and grown and grown. Over half of all members of Congress are millionaires. It is almost impossible for someone to rise out of the working class and into the upper class. CEOs make an average of 300 times as much money as their average employee. Some of the most necessary jobs make the least money. 1 in 5 children today are born into poverty, and of course this is higher in minority communities. I know that the system is not fixable. It's the same system it's always been, and it's serving the rich and powerful just like it always has. My worldview operates on one fundamental belief, that every single person of every background has equal value and has a place in society. This way of thinking is not what guides the society we live in now. If we want to live in a real democracy, we have to change things. If we want a government that actually represents us, the bulk of the population, we have to change things. If we want things to be equal, we have to change things. It is time to turn our anger into action, to turn our passion into planning. For many of us, it's time to end our silence. If we want to live somewhere where we can be proud of, somewhere where everyone truly has a fair and equal chance at life and an equal voice in how we do things, then the time has come. It is time for revolution. If you believe as I do that each one of us has a right to be here and to have a say, that our future should not be decided for us by the powers that be, that it's time to stop honoring the ghost of an America that committed unspeakable atrocities and waged countless inhumane wars with the goal of getting the powerful more power and the rich more wealth, then it's time for revolution. James Baldwin, a civil rights leader and author, wrote, "Not everything that is faced can be changed. but nothing can be changed until it is faced. I believe it's time to face America's past and how it informs America's present. It is time to face centuries of injustice and the people who still today profit from that injustice. Today, these institutions of our society that have the most power use that power to elevate the elite few and break apart and disadvantage the disempowered many. Today, these institutions not only allow oppression and inequality, they necessitate them. I cannot in good conscience advocate for change within the system. We cannot effect enough change from within the system. The system itself must be replaced. In revolution, you and I break the chains that hold us to these institutions. In revolution, you and I can stop clinging to the same national identity that has enforced inequality. And in revolution, you and I can build a better society and a better world together. It is a good time for revolution because people have never been more connected. This land needs first and foremost a revolution of ideas and a destruction of this American identity moored in the wrongdoings of the past. It is time for change.